Good morning. It's good to be here with you. Enjoyed our time studying Luke, the 12th chapter this morning. And there's a phrase I asked you to consider. And so be turning over there as we'll look at that in just a moment. While you're turning over, thank you for the opportunity to be here as I look to commit myself to the work of preaching and evangelism. And I'm grateful to have the chance to meet you and see the work being done here in San Angelo. And I'm very encouraged by the many of you that I've already met and look forward to meeting you more as we eat lunch together this afternoon. So looking forward to that time. So I won't spend much time introducing myself, and we'll get right into our study. Luke chapter 12, as we were talking about, is a challenge against all of us to consider, what are we striving after? What is it that we're focusing on? And are we afraid because we aren't getting the things that we think we want? Are we afraid or anxious about this life and what we are trying to accomplish here? And there's the charge against those who were thinking in a very earthly mindset. He says there in Luke chapter 12, when talking about what their problem is, he says, "O you of little faith," Luke chapter 12 and verse 28. And I had you at the end of class consider, how do you define faith? What is faith, and how do we strengthen our faith? And so we'll talk about that this morning, because we see statements like this, "O you of little faith," or "we should be walking by faith and not by sight." What is it about faith that encourages us, that strengthens us, and calls us to be different, and how to be able to look at the world around us differently? And I think Paul grasps an idea here in Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, when he says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." If we are going to be people of the gospel, we too should not be ashamed of the message that it heralds. The message that it brings about salvation to everyone who believes, and that we can live by faith. Again, what is faith, and why is it so important to our life of righteousness? Well, if you know Romans 1, 16 and 17, you know that when he quotes, "the righteous shall live by faith," it comes from the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4. Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4 simply says, "Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by faith." So be turning over to Habakkuk, because I think it's important for us. If Paul found it so important to help us understand faith by quoting from Habakkuk, what is it about faith that we learn from Habakkuk's story? So we're going to spend some time in this short book. It's just 3 chapters long, and see what we can learn. You'll notice that chapter 1, verse 1 opens with Habakkuk's prayer, but it calls it an oracle. If you do just a little bit of digging, you'll learn that a more literal translation is the burden that Habakkuk bore. And boy, did he bear a burden. I think one that we can all sympathize with. Something that will come from this lesson that you will be able to relate to and understand the story of Habakkuk and why he is chosen as an example of faith. Read with me verses 1 through 4. "The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so the justice goes forth perverted. When you consider Habakkuk's pleas, two questions stand out to me. How long will this continue, and why is it happening? Those questions sound familiar. Have you uttered them yourself when you're in the midst of looking for a job, or why am I inflicted with this pain, or why did I lose a loved one? Why is this happening, God? What is going on? What am I supposed to learn here? For Habakkuk, I don't think there's two more poignant questions to be asked. Think for just a moment about his position. Here you have a prophet of God, the mouthpiece, the man who was supposed to be bringing the words of God to the people. And he starts out by saying, how long shall I cry for help? Habakkuk has been obviously praying to God for some time, crying for relief, crying for an answer, and God's not answering. If anyone should be able to get an answer from God, it should be the man called to speak what God tells him. As a prophet, that would be the one thing I would hope I could hang my hat on. God, when I come to you, I want an answer. You called me to do your work. How long am I going to keep calling to you and you won't tell me anything? But even more than that, consider where Habakkuk is. He's in the southern tribe of Judah. As the mouthpiece of God, he is proclaiming God's message to the people. All the while, you have the Assyrians from the north that are pressing in and causing disruption in their culture. And then from the south, you have Egypt coming up. Not even that, they're in cohort. The Assyrians and the Egyptians are working together and oppressing the promised land of God. So much so that the Pharaoh of Egypt, he takes Jehoahaz off the throne. The Pharaoh of Egypt comes in, removes Jehoahaz as king, and he puts Jehoiakim in. Now Jehoiakim is acting as a puppet for Egypt. So think about it. You're proclaiming God's message. From the north, there's oppression. From the south, there's oppression. The righteousness of God's throne in the promised land is turned on end. And it's being held in the hand of Egypt. And things continue to digress such that God's law is not being upheld. God, how long will this continue? How long will you allow your righteous nation to be oppressed? I don't know about you, but when I've asked those questions in my own prayer or my own studies, I can tell you I want an answer. Not long, Greg. Hang in there. It's gonna be okay. Or just a little while longer. Just hang in there. Those are answers we're good with. It's not the answer Habakkuk gets. Read on with me and notice how God responds to Habakkuk. In his response in verses 5 through 11, God says, "Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if I told you. For behold, I am rising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. Habakkuk looking for an answer and relief, a message of hope that he could carry back to the Israelites, to the people of God in Judah. And God says, look, it's going to get worse. Look out and see, because you think Assyria's bad. Do you think Egypt is oppressing you? Do you think Jehoiakim is causing wickedness from within? I'm going to bring the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, who only care about their own strength and their own power. Did you notice that? At the very end of God's response, he says, their own might is their God. When we go to God in prayer, seeking relief, how would you respond if he said it's going to get worse? Because it's going to sometimes. And yet, in Luke, we were told, don't be anxious about this life. Don't fear these things that you see around you. And so Habakkuk is placed in this position that he's supposed to go back and tell Israel what's going on, and the news he has to relay is the Babylonians are coming. And God says, you're not going to understand it, but I need you to look out and see that I am working. I do have my hand in this. So the question becomes, how is Habakkuk going to respond when the Lord says, take a look again? Look, see, I'm bringing a more wicked nation. Habakkuk turns to God with another prayer. Verses 12 through 17, he says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He drags them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Habakkuk's wrestling with this idea. God, you're bringing a more wicked nation, and you say you're going to bring judgment, but it doesn't make sense, God. You are holy. You've called us to be your people. You are too pure to look at evil like this, God. This is not who I thought I served. I thought you were righteous to your people, and you're going to bring more evil upon us? It's one of the hardest truths we face in life. When we see others struggling, we see the oppression around us, we see the evil building up around us. Look at this world. Just in my lifetime, the position our country alone has shifted on abortion, marriage, gender identity, any number of things that you look out and your heart weeps for the evil that abounds. Is it going to be that it gets worse before it gets better? And if it is, does that change our view of God? Do we still see him as holy and righteous? Habakkuk's struggling to see it. I don't understand, God. Because if this keeps going on, are you going to keep bringing a more wicked nation, one after the other, and it's just going to cause more oppression? Notice it, verse 17. Is this oppression that you're bringing going to continue forever? Is this how you will deal with us from here on out? And Habakkuk has to decide, what is he going to do in this moment? And so chapter 2 opens up with his response. He says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower. And I will look out and see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. I think if we get nothing else out of Habakkuk, this statement right here is a powerful statement for when we are fearing the lack of life around us, or we are fearing or anxious about the trials that we're facing with. Habakkuk says, God, I don't understand what's going on here. I can't make sense of how you can be holy and cause the oppression. So I'm going to change my perspective. I'm going to climb to the watchtower, and I will look out and see. I will look for your hand in action, God. And I will stop and consider the things that you show me. I will stop and consider what you want me to know in this moment. If you're going through something right now, we can get inside our heads, and anxiety builds. Fear of what lies ahead. Are our days numbered? Is there going to be more wickedness? The challenge for us as Christians, much like Habakkuk, is to maintain a perspective that is always looking for God's hand in every situation. And God responds. As Habakkuk stands on top of his watchtower, God responds in chapter 2, verses 2 through 20. We won't take time to read the whole thing. We don't have that kind of time this morning. But look at the first 5 verses, with verses 2 through 5. The Lord answered, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol, like death he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects all his own people. And he goes on in chapter 6, or verse 6 and following to the end of the chapter, to share 5 different woes. We'll speak about them briefly in a moment. But the first thing I want to notice is there are 2 expectations of Habakkuk. If you don't understand what I am telling you about what is coming, wait. Don't try to solve it yourself. Don't try to build up for yourself the walls to protect yourself. Don't try to go fix everything yourself. Wait. Wait patiently to see my hand at work. And then verse 4, the righteous shall live by faith. There he's drawing a contrast. Habakkuk is right. How long will this keep going that more and more wicked nations come? God says, you want to know what's going to come of them? His soul is puffed up. He is not right within himself. Do not give him any glory. Do not fear him. He has nothing to oppress you with. The way you're going to live and survive this scenario, Habakkuk, is through faith. Faith is going to be the answer to all of your questions. Like I said, he goes on to speak of all these woes, and it's really woes to anyone who would try to build up for themselves or make themselves a greater position in this life. Look at the list, verses 6 through 8. Those who oppress others by taking what belongs to others, whether loaning by loan, taking it from them and building up their own wealth at the expense of others, or by tearing others down, beating them down and taking what is theirs, making them feel less. As we talked about in Luke, that was what the Pharisees were doing to the poor and those who had nothing to offer to the community. We are not like the Pharisees, is how Habakkuk would say it. God is saying, do not tear others down. Don't kill others. Do not conquer nations to try to build yourself up. Don't use wine to make them drunk so that you'll have the upper hand and be able to negotiate more for yourself than for them. That's unfair. We don't work like that as a people of God. But ultimately, he says in verses 18 and 19, woe to him who worships idols. Woe to him who tries to amass anything that is not God. Woe to him who turns and fears and is anxious for anything that God has not called him to build up. And so Habakkuk now has to decide, how will he respond? How will he respond to God saying, I am bringing a judgment that is just, and this is how I will do it. I will challenge why they are building themselves up. I will challenge how they've built themselves up. And he says, before leaving it in Habakkuk's hands, all these others worship other idols. But behold, in verse 20 of chapter 2, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. Habakkuk, God is reigning on his throne. He is where he belongs, controlling the heavens and the earth. What will you do in response? Keep silent and consider what you say. And so Habakkuk's response, I believe, is one of the most powerful statements of faith. Because we see Habakkuk's response in chapter 3, starting in verse 2. O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. And I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Stop there and consider how Habakkuk's response begins. He says, I have heard of you, God. Thank you for reminding me, because I know who you are. I remember you. I know your deeds. I have heard of them from my father. I have heard of them from the people of Israel, from the generations that come before. What does he call into account there? Notice it in verse 3. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. You can go to Deuteronomy, and Moses would put it in terms of from Mount Sinai. What does Habakkuk remember? When he says, God, I know who you are. I remember now. You're the God that brought your people out of oppression. You brought them through the wilderness. You brought them to the mountain, to yourself. As he talked about in verse 2, verse 2, you came clouds. You presented yourself to your people at Mount Sinai. God, I know who you are because you have proven yourself before. You are a righteous God. I know your deeds, and more than that, I know that you are the God of salvation. Notice it with me in verse 8. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea, when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? He says down in verse 13, you went out for the salvation of your people. Habakkuk says, God, I know who you are. Everything you have done, every story that I have heard of you, at the root of it, you have always been riding out to conquer for the salvation of your people. God, I know you. You are a righteous God. You are holy. And because of that, verse 16 says, I hear of these things again. I recall these things, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rust enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of the trouble to come upon people who invade us. God, I know there will come a day when you will bring the people who oppress us into account. So I will wait patiently. I won't challenge you anymore. I will trust you. And he goes on to say, verse 17 through 19, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit on the vines, nor there be produce of the olive, and the fields yield no food. The flock will be cut off from the fold, and there will be no herd in the stalls. God, even when our food is gone, and there is no hope at saving the flock that you've blessed us with, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. Babylon is coming. But God, I know who you are. You are a God who seeks my salvation. You are looking out for my good. You are faithful to that promise. I know it from Moses. I know it from the Exodus story. I can look through the tribes of Israel in the many ways you've protected us over the generations. God, I know you. And no matter what comes now, God, I will rely on you. See, Habakkuk's faith, as some might attribute it, is not blind. It is not blind trust and just a hope and a grasp that somehow God's going to save us. No, it's deeply rooted in knowing God and seeing his hand in every story on every page of the Bible. Every story reminds us he is our God and the God of salvation. Which brings us back to where we jumped off. Romans 1:16 and 17, where he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel message, for it is salvation to everyone who believes by the power of God. To the Jew first and also to the Greek, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Paul's message in Romans actually starts in verses 1 through 3, where he talks about the gospel is the gospel of Christ and how Christ fulfills all the prophecy. And he says it is salvation. The message of Christ is the salvation to everyone who believes. And it is proof that God cares about his creation. Habakkuk only had Mount Sinai to remember and a few stories from the Old Testament, which are powerful in and of themselves. But as we talked about in Luke this morning, Luke is saying the Son of Man is here. The Son of Man has come. Do not shy away from proclaiming to everyone the great news of the Son of Man, of Christ. if we are going to strengthen our faith, we, like Habakkuk, must be devout in prayer. Going to God and laying our burdens on Him and giving Him a chance to bring us hope and joy and peace. And that comes when we stop to gain perspective. When we step back from looking at what's going on in front of us and we stop to go to our watchtower and we look for God's hand in the situation. We look for God's salvation, His hope. It comes when we remind ourselves God already gave His Son. Of how much more value are we than the little birds? Of how much more value are we than the home that you might lose? Than the job that you might strain with? Than the loss of a loved one? Or any trial that you go through? Facing trials is not a sign of God giving up on us. Facing trials is a chance for us to show our faith. Are you willing to put trust in God to place your steps? When life gets hard, when the mountains are rocky, and you can't see what the next step is that's going to make life easier, will you put your faith in God? Will you find peace in knowing at the end of our days, these trials will not matter because our salvation is secured in Christ? Whatever your need is this morning, whatever you're struggling with, we are a blessed people. And if you need help gaining perspective, if you need help reminding yourself that these trials are just a moment in life and to be patient and wait, we will wait with you. We will study with you. We will help you gain perspective. We will pray with you. Or maybe you need to commit yourself to a life of serving Christ. We're here to do that as well. Whatever your need is, we are here to hear it as we stand and as we sing.